40 people were slaughtered on Palm Sunday night in Nigeria. At a community, at a wedding. And while the Nigerian police were busy arguing about the body count, a United States congressman was on X telling Nigerian government officials, "We know who you are and we have the tools to hold you accountable." Here's what nobody is asking. This wasn't just a reaction tweet. This man has been to Nigeria. He sat in IDP camps, he looked survivors in the eye, and he came back and wrote a report that went straight to Donald Trump's desk. So the real question is, what exactly does America plan to do about this? And what does it mean for Nigeria if they actually follow through? Stay with me, because this one is bigger than most people realize. Before we go deeper, if you're just finding Niger Newsfeed, welcome. This channel exists to break down what's really happening in Nigerian politics, without the noise, without the spin. Hit subscribe and stay with me, because this one gets interesting. On the night of Sunday, March 29, 2026, Palm Sunday, gunmen suspected to be terrorists struck two locations simultaneously. The first was Angwanrukuba community in Jos North local government area of Plateau State. The second was Kahir village in Kagako local government area of Kaduna State. In Kaduna, the attackers hit a wedding ceremony at around 11:47 at night. Armed with AK-47 rifles, they stormed the venue in large numbers and opened fire inside the hall, killing 13 people on the spot. Several others sustained gunshot wounds, and an unspecified number of guests were abducted in the chaos that followed. In Plateau, the numbers are contested, and that dispute itself tells you something. Community sources reported 27 people killed in Angwanrukuba. The Plateau State Police Command put the figure at 14. Between those two numbers are faces, families, and a gap that the government has not explained. As a result of the attack, the University of Jos rescheduled its examinations that had been planned for Monday and Tuesday. Schools shutting down because of overnight violence. That is the reality on the ground. The next day, U.S. Congressman Riley Moore, who had previously been part of a congressional fact-finding delegation to Nigeria on allegations of Christian genocide, reacted via X, calling the Palm Sunday killings part of a troubling pattern of violence targeting worshippers during religious observances. Now, here's the thing. This wasn't just a politician tweeting into the void. Moore's reaction carried serious institutional weight, and to understand why, you need to understand exactly who he is and what he's already set in motion. In October 2025, President Trump redesignated Nigeria as a country of particular concern, known as a CPC, for ongoing violations of religious freedom. Following that designation, Trump personally directed Congressman Moore and House Appropriations Committee Chairman Tom Cole to lead a comprehensive congressional investigation into the persecution of Christian communities in Nigeria. This is not a minor designation. A CPC label under U.S. law triggers a review of diplomatic and economic relationships. It's the same category used for countries like China and Iran. Nigeria has been placed in that company. Moore's resulting report, which he presented to the White House in February 2026, recommends establishing a bilateral U.S.-Nigeria security agreement withholding certain U.S. funds until the Nigerian government takes demonstrable action and imposing sanctions and visa restrictions on individuals and groups allegedly responsible for or complicit in religious persecution. It also calls for the repeal of blasphemy and Sharia laws in Nigeria. That recommendation in particular has massive constitutional and political implications inside Nigeria because those laws exist at the state level across multiple northern states, and the federal government has limited direct power to compel their repeal. So when Moore fired off that warning on Palm Sunday night, he wasn't speaking as a random U.S. politician. He was speaking as the man who just submitted Nigeria's file to the White House. That changes the weight of every word he says. Here's something most commentators are glossing over. Moore's post didn't just condemn the killings. It said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that Nigerian government officials had created an environment in which Christians are routinely persecuted and slaughtered, and that those officials should know the US knows who they are and has the tools to hold them accountable. That is not diplomatic language. That is a threat, and it was directed not at the terrorists, but at Nigerian government officials. We'll come back to what that means in Section 4. Let's strip this down to power and interests. Who benefits from the current situation continuing? First, understand the pattern Moore identified. He described the Palm Sunday killings as part of a pattern of attacks targeting Christians on holy days, saying that terrorists have struck on virtually every single Christian holy day in recent memory. Whether you accept his religious framing or not, the pattern itself is a documented fact, and patterns don't happen by accident. Patterns happen when there are no consequences. That's the first political reality. Impunity has been the operating environment in the Middle Belt and parts of the Northwest for years. When attackers consistently disappear into the bush and are rarely prosecuted, you have to ask, who is this impunity serving? The Middle Belt Forum alleged that a Middle Belt state had become a staging ground for attacks on neighboring states, including Benue, Plateau, Taraba, Kogi, and parts of Kaduna. They also criticized security agencies for allegedly disarming local populations even after they repelled attacks, while perpetrators remained free. That allegation, if true, is extraordinary. It would mean that the communities being victimized are being stripped of the ability to defend themselves, while those attacking them face no consequence. That is not a security failure. That is a policy outcome. Someone is benefiting from that arrangement. The Tinubu government's position. President Tinubu is balancing multiple fires simultaneously. The North is a critical political constituency. He needs northern governors on side for his 2027 re-election calculations. The governors of the 19 northern states have formally reaffirmed their commitment to Tinubu's security and developmental agenda. That alignment matters, but it also constrains what Tinubu can say and do about violence in the North without fracturing his coalition. The American pressure calculus. Moore's report was the result of months of investigation, including a bipartisan congressional fact-finding trip to Nigeria, hearings with expert witnesses, consultations with religious leaders, meetings with internally displaced persons, and engagement with senior Nigerian government officials. His delegation met with Nigeria's National Security Advisor, Nuhu Ribadu, in Abuja in December 2025 to discuss ways to find a lasting solution to the killings. So, the conversation is happening at the highest levels of the Nigerian security establishment. Ribadu knows what's coming. Tinubu's government knows. The question is whether they will move fast enough to get ahead of it. The silent players. Watch the northern governors. Watch how quickly or how slowly arrests and prosecutions follow these attacks. The silence of key political figures in the aftermath of attacks like these is itself a data point. It tells you where the political protection runs. Now, if what I just laid out surprises you, drop a comment below. I want to know your take before we get to the part that changes the whole picture. Let's talk about what this means for Nigeria as a whole, not just the communities directly affected. Security architecture. The Middle Belt Forum urged the Nigerian government to establish a supervised system that would enable the mass production and lawful distribution of basic self-defense tools at affordable cost for affected communities. That's a community organization effectively telling Abuja, your security forces are not protecting us and you won't even let us protect ourselves. The implications for federal credibility in the Middle Belt are serious. Economic consequences. The communities under attack are largely agrarian. Plateau and Kaduna have historically been major contributors to Nigeria's food production, from tin mining legacies to vegetable farming. When communities flee, farms are abandoned. When farmers are killed or displaced, food production drops. This isn't abstract. It feeds directly into the food inflation ordinary Nigerians are already experiencing. Interfaith and interethnic dynamics. This is the most sensitive dimension, and I want to be careful here. The attacks are being framed in religious terms, by Moore, by some Nigerian civil society groups, and by some of the communities affected.
The Nigerian government tends to frame it in ethnic and economic terms: farmers-herder clashes, competition for land and water. Both framings capture part of the reality. The danger is that neither framing produces the right policy response on its own. What's clear is that the killings are generating genuine communal grief and rage, and that rage, if not managed, breeds the conditions for retaliatory violence, which then becomes its own cycle. Earlier, I told you Moore's Palm Sunday statement was a threat aimed at Nigerian officials, not just at terrorists. Now let me show you the full architecture behind that threat. In October 2025, Nigeria was redesignated as a country of particular concern for ongoing violations of religious freedom. President Trump simultaneously warned that the US might halt all aid and could take direct action if the Nigerian government fails to stop what he described as horrible atrocities against Christians. That threat, stopping all US aid, is not symbolic. The US remains Nigeria's one significant bilateral partner. US aid flows through multiple channels, including health, education, and security cooperation programs. A full withdrawal would have measurable consequences. The American congressional delegation that visited Nigeria in December 2025 moved through Benue State in armored vehicles as they met Catholic and Protestant leaders, bishops, community heads, and displaced families to obtain what Moore called ground truth. Moore also dismissed the climate change and economic framing of the violence, asking why, if it were purely about land, attackers would burn down churches and attack IDP camps shouting religious slogans. For Nigerians in the diaspora, here is what you need to understand. This is no longer a story that the Nigerian government can manage by releasing a casualty figure and issuing a condolence statement. There is now a formal congressional record, a report on the President of the United States desk, and a sitting lawmaker on X naming Nigerian officials as people who will be held accountable. The diplomatic space for Nigeria to continue business as usual is shrinking.
Let me give you the strongest pushback, because this story deserves intellectual honesty. Counter-argument 1. The religious framing is reductive. Critics of Moore's narrative, including some Nigerian academics and policy analysts, argue that the violence in the Middle Belt has complex roots: colonial-era land policies, climate change shrinking grazing routes, population pressure, and the collapse of traditional conflict resolution mechanisms between farming and herding communities. They argue that reducing it entirely to Islamic terrorism versus Christians misses structural drivers and could actually make resolution harder by inflaming religious identity on both sides. That argument has merit and deserves serious engagement. But here is where it falls apart. Structural explanations don't account for the targeting pattern. Attacks on Palm Sunday, on Christmas Eve, on Easter, the timing is not random. Structural land disputes don't produce coordinated holiday massacres. Counter-argument 2. US interference is neo-colonial. Some voices in Nigeria, particularly from the North, argue that American intervention in Nigerian religious affairs is a form of neo-colonialism, using the language of human rights to advance geopolitical interests. That critique deserves respect. The US has a long history of selectively applying pressure based on strategic interests, not pure humanitarian concern. However, that critique on its own does nothing for the families burying their dead in Plateau and Kaduna right now. The question isn't whether America's motives are pure. They really are. The question is whether the killings are real, whether the Nigerian state is responding adequately, and whether international pressure, whatever its motivation, might produce better outcomes for the victims. Misconception. This is a new crisis. It is not new. This corridor, Plateau, Kaduna, Benue, Taraba, has been bleeding for over a decade. What is new is the international institutional attention. That's the change worth tracking. And here's the detail almost nobody has picked up on. The Middle Belt Forum said it was willing to cooperate with the United States and other international stakeholders by providing information on individuals allegedly involved in violence in the Middle Belt.
A Nigerian civil society group is inviting a foreign government to gather intelligence inside Nigeria. That is how far trust in the Nigerian state has collapsed in these communities. What happens next? Here's what I am watching. Most likely next moves. The Tinubu government will respond diplomatically. Expect a statement from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and possibly from Aso Rock, reaffirming Nigeria's commitment to protecting all citizens. They will want to de-escalate the international pressure without making structural commitments that alienate northern political allies. On the U.S. side, watch whether the Palm Sunday killings make it into any formal congressional record or hearing. Moore has the platform and the motivation. If he calls a hearing, that raises the stakes significantly. Signals of escalation to watch for. If U.S. sanctions or visa restrictions are actually imposed on named Nigerian individuals, that moves this from rhetoric to action. If the withholding of U.S. funding is triggered under the country of particular concern framework, that will have concrete economic effects. If another major attack occurs on a Christian holy day, with Easter just days away at the time of this recording, the pressure on the Tinubu government could become politically unsustainable. Best case and worst case. Best case, the combination of U.S. pressure and genuine Nigerian government action produces a sustained security operation in the affected communities, real arrests, real prosecutions, and a credible federal response that begins to rebuild trust in the Middle Belt. This could also become an opportunity to revive genuine national conversation on security sector reform. Worst case, the killings continue. U.S. rhetoric escalates into punitive measures, Nigeria's diplomatic relationship with Washington deteriorates, northern political figures dig in defensively, and the communities in Plateau, Kaduna, and Benue remain unprotected while politicians on both sides of the Atlantic score points over their graves. The long-term impact if nothing changes? International isolation grows, domestic trust in the state collapses further, and the Middle Belt becomes an ungoverned corridor that destabilizes the entire north-central region and potentially beyond. So I asked you at the start, what does America actually plan to do about this, and what does it mean for Nigeria if they follow through? Here's the honest answer. We don't yet know whether this escalates to sanctions, aid withdrawal, or something more. What we know is that this is no longer a Nigerian domestic story that the Abuja press corps can manage. There is a congressional report on Trump's desk written by a man who sat in IDP camps in Benue and met the survivors face to face. The Palm Sunday killings just added fresh urgency to that file. For Nigeria, the choice is stark. Take credible, visible, verifiable action to protect vulnerable communities, or watch the U.S. slowly turn the screws on diplomatic and economic relations at the worst possible time for an economy already under pressure. And for all of us watching this story, the measure of a state is not just what it says when people are killed. It's whether anyone is arrested, whether anyone is prosecuted, whether any community is safer a year from now than it is today. That's the standard, and so far, Nigeria has not met it. What do you think? Is international pressure the only thing that will force change, or is it making a complex situation worse? Drop your take in the comments. If this breakdown gave you clarity on what's really going on, do me a favor, share it with one person who needs to understand this. Like the video, subscribe to Niger News Feed, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay sharp.